thanks for joining. We have now 46 participants in this session. Hello, Jenni. So basically, welcome to Vienna, or remote at least. So hi to Denmark, I bet. Just a short intro of Jenni. We know each other, I think, since last Agile Tour, where Jenni had a talk about, the keynote actually, about intent-based leadership, which I find a especially great concept from, I think it originally from David Marquette, who wrote the book Turn the Ship Around, which I highly recommend to you. So Jenni, you are a transformation coach. You are working for Go Agile in Denmark together with your husband, Ole. You have a neuroscience background, and also this talk is like kind of the Agile Tour now, which is remote and which is an experiment. So we have lots of experiments today, also with your talk, because you said it's the first time ever. So this is an exclusive first time talk here at the Agile Tour. So I'm very proud of it. And I think this talk has everything. It has data, it has neuroscience, agile experiments. So it's about leadership, and also a topic which every agile coach I think knows a lot in a change process. How do you engage people? So I'm really much looking forward to this talk, and that's it basically. And I hand over to you, Jenni. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rickard. Yes, I'm excited to be part of Agile Tour Vienna once again, and in this virtual experiment. And yes, as Rickard said, this talk is also an experiment, and I'll share more about that later. So we work a lot with large Agile transformations. And a transformation of any kind is a change initiative. And what we have found, as I'm sure you have also found, that these big transformations are often really overwhelming. People just can't get their heads around so many changes all at once, and especially if it's coming from the top down, it just feels like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do all of it. It's too hard. It's too much. We don't know what this is going to look like. So breaking down the changes, as we do in Agile ways of working, and then looking at those pieces that make people feel uncertain, or maybe there's quite a bit of resistance to. Those situations are where experiments are ideal. We all know the benefits of working in an Agile way: influence, autonomy, better solutions, usually more motivated people working in teams, better relationships, all of those things. But yet there's still resistance to implementing these types of changes. And this talk is really about not just Agile transformation type changes, but any kind of changes where people feel uncertain or have some resistance to making the change. Experiments are a great tool. So today I'm going to talk about why use experiments, why they work, and then a little how-to. I guess it's our experiment hack, what we have had success with. So I'll be sharing that with you. And there'll also be a little interactivity, I hope, in the chat. And so later, Rickard, I will ask you to share that from an audio perspective. So that would be great, but that's later. So why use experiments? What can we know up front? So the conven framework, Dave Snowden's wonderful framework, I just read that it's celebrating 21 years since its inception. We use this a lot because the types of things that work well with experiments are in the complex domain. This is where we don't know up front. We might have an idea, we might have some experience, but because we're working in different situations with different people and different sorts of changes, we can't know that up front. So looking at the conven framework and understanding where the issues are. And if you're not familiar with the framework, let me just take you quickly through it. So the obvious domain, these are things that Problem, answer. We see it, we can put it in a box, and we can solve it. The complicated things are the things where we need an expert for. So we see the problem, we analyze it with some expert help usually, and then we can make a response to it. The chaotic situations, it's like the house is on fire, or something happened with an item in production, we need to just run and solve it, put out the fire. We're not doing so much thinking up front. It's the complex issues, these situations where we cannot know up front, that are ideal for experiments, right? Because what's an experiment? We probe, try to make a hypothesis. We sense, so get the data to either reinforce our hypothesis or take us in another direction, and then we respond based on that information. So complex situations are great for experiments. Alrighty. And then, so the whole thing about change, right? So change is really, really hard on the brain. And this continuum, it's called the toward away continuum. And when we are feeling, yes, this is so exciting, change is a challenge, we're over here, right, in this space, where our prefrontal cortex, the thinking, rational thinking area of the brain is activated, and we've got energy, and we want to solve things and figure it out. We see change as a challenge in that space. On the other side, where change is really dangerous, and that's our natural reaction, right? So change is something new for the brain, and anything new for the brain is categorized as dangerous. So we need to get over that limbic system activation where our fight, flight, or freeze is, where we're trying to survive the situation. It's like, oh, all this agile stuff, if I just close down, it will go away. And my guess is you've worked with teams or managers or other people in maybe not your current organization, but other organizations, where any type of change, do a stand-up meeting. I mean, okay, so in Denmark, some of the resistance we've had to stand-up meeting is that stand-up meeting is in English, stand-up meeting, instead of store up, which is Danish for stand-up meeting. I mean, we find some weird things to push changes away, and that's the limbic system activation, and that's over on that move away from danger side. So the trick is that we want to nudge people toward this reward side, where dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter, is released in the brain. And this helps us to come to better solutions. So if we can nudge people to this more open, change is a challenge side of the brain, we get better thinking. And experiments just happen to be one way that we can nudge people over to this moving toward reward side of the brain, rather than protecting ourselves from danger, which is the other side, where your limbic system is activated. So using experiments, real experiments, as a way to help us to nudge toward reward, to help people really focus on, hey, what can we do differently? How can we learn from this? How can we improve? Experiments do this. So I've been talking a little bit about experiments. I'm going to go into more detail about exactly what I mean, but let me just take a quick step back and say, for us, an experiment has some title or a hypothesis statement, a little description, usually success criteria, start date, end date, evaluation date. It's that simple. And I'm going to get more into detail about the actual experiment and maybe share a couple stories as we go forward here. And Rickard, if you're still there, if any questions are coming up, it's okay to interrupt. I don't mind whatsoever, but we'll also have time for questions at the end. All right, so the whole thing about change. As leaders at every level in an organization, if we can understand how people react to change. So on that toward away continuum, we know that we're on this continuum between change is dangerous and change is a challenge all the time. It depends on how much energy we have, what happened to us earlier in the day. A lot of those things affect how we think. And understanding how people react to change and go through the stages, if you will, of a change process is also really important, and I think is key to understanding why experiments actually work. So we start, I love this model is called the rooms of change. And essentially all change models are the same. You start from one position, the status quo, if you will, and then you do something different. So you're unfreezing as you learn new habits, new ways of working, new things. And then you sort of refreeze. You freeze again into this new spot. And that is shared amongst every change model that I've seen anyway. So anyway, I love the rooms of change. It's a visual, and it's a great way to sort of think about how people react to change. So we start where we are right now. This is, it's okay how I'm working. You know, this whole thing about planning together, this weird big room planning thing. It's so many people, but yeah, I don't know. So we're going into the denial room right here, because our old way of planning, it wasn't great, but it was okay, and I know it. And now somebody wants me to do this big room planning thing. Oh, I don't think so. Maybe if I just put on the blinders, all of this will go away. Oh, this is terrible. I'm just going to sit here and everybody else can do this planning stuff. I don't want to do this. That's the denial stage. If I don't do anything, maybe it will all go away. I've actually worked with some software engineers, maybe a little older than me, who have been around a while, who just basically told me, this too shall pass. If I just ignore it, this too shall pass. That is denial. When we get through that denial stage, if we can get through that denial stage, this is where we're trying new things. So this is maybe the actual experiment part, if you will, where we're trying things in a different way, and it's confusing and maybe a little chaotic, and maybe you feel like your head is going to explode because it's so different from how you did things before. When we feel the benefit of the new way, we move up into the renewal space. And this is where our brain is just saying, hey, this isn't so bad. I can do this. This is okay. All right. All right. This new way, I actually like it. This works. And then we go back into a new status quo. So these are the rooms of change. And as leaders, when we understand how people deal with change, we can help them sort of move through these stages quicker by using experiments, for example, or breaking down change in other ways as well. Yes. Okay. So another key to making experiments work is that we involve and engage people in the process. When we involve and engage people in a change, like we do when we run experiments, we get their acceptance. So the research shows that when people feel that they've had influence in a change or a change process or a change initiative, that they are more likely to accept it, even if they don't agree 100% with the change. So just having that influence is enough to sort of calm down our limbic systems that are screaming, this is dangerous for me, and instead activate the prefrontal cortex so that we're able to see the possibilities and be part of the solution. So use your facilitation techniques, right? So we present the goal. For instance, we want to run an experiment about, let's say, I'll use an example from my own work life. One of the programs that I was working with, this was a while ago, they were like, oh, we want to put the backlog into Jira. Okay, a lot of the teams were fighting that. So they ran an experiment. So the goal was, we want to put the backlog into Jira and create an experiment to do that. So by brainstorming ideas about what are the success criteria, how could we do this, what conditions need to be in place, doing that discussion, right? So starting to close again, and then deciding on, okay, what's the actual experiment? What will the actual experiment be? And that result is your experiment. So in this process, we provide clarity about the change and what we're trying to achieve. We give the authority, right? We're pushing the authority to people with the information. So the ones that are actually going to do the work or who are affected by the change most directly. And then we create that ownership, right? So the people who are most directly affected actually own it. So use your facilitation as part of this. And I know Luke Coleman is doing something later today around portfolio, and I think facilitation and it is an underused, I think, way of involving and engaging people, and it's perfect for experiments. Yes. Okay, so getting into the experiment here. Now, having a title, a description, success criteria, the start date, the end date, evaluation date, and maybe there are some conditions in place. Rickard mentioned that, yeah, not only is Agile Tour Vienna this year a virtual experiment, my talk is also an experiment, and normally the experiments involve more than me, but this is, I'll take a picture of this later and put it up on Twitter. So this is my experiment for this talk, and basically looking at, okay, well, what is it? So it's my talk. It's the first time that I'm sharing a technique rather than pragmatic principles around leadership or neuroscience or agile ways of working. So the focus of my talk, the experiment, is around presenting the technique. So
Jenni,
my success criteria.
would you like to have the questions now or later then?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because I think it fits.
Yes.
We have here the question.
Perfect.
How to deal with naysayers, especially those who will stay forever in the organization. And what is your experience with the percentage of people that always are those naysayers, no matter what, cannot work here?
Yep. Great. I love it. Thank you. Yeah, so I flip back to this toward away continuum with that question. And those naysayers are usually on, this part of the continuum. So what we want to do is nudge them a little bit more toward that reward side. And the best way to do that is to meet people where they are. So if they are on this side, then trying to coerce them or convince them that a change that you want to make is the right thing to do is not going to work. There'll be more resistance. So instead, one idea that at least has worked for me, especially using experiments, is to say, look, we're going to create an experiment here, a real experiment, with the hypothesis, success criteria, start date, end date, evaluation date, conditions. We are going to collect data as part of this experiment. We're not going to force this on you. We want to know, we have a hypothesis. We want to know if it's going to work. We need you. We need your experience, your valuable contributions, your insights in order to run this experiment. Without you, we can't make it work. We won't know, and we don't want to force anything on you. So just doing that usually is enough for people to open up just a little bit more and okay, they want my contribution. Yep. I have influence in this, so that it's usually enough. And especially if we're looking at real experiments that we have.
Yeah, just one more. I think it also fits because you mentioned the Jira example.
Cool.
And the question is, from Wilhelm coming here, how many of the people would you actually involve? All developers of the company? Here's the fear that this would lead to endless discussions, or just a subset like the tech leads or so?
Yeah, so a representative group. In this case, it was 3 feature teams, so it wasn't so overwhelming. And that was, it wasn't an issue in creating the experiment with those teams. The key is an experiment that we can run in the space where the people who are affected by the result have influence in it. So creating that experiment with a representative group. So rather than a sort of a subset, just the tech leads, I would have a few tech leads, I'd have some developers, other roles in creating the actual experiment.
Thank you, Jenni. That's it.
Thank you. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm not going to bore you with more of my experiment. I'll post it instead, because I think getting into a little bit more about these experiments and then getting your input on some of it will be better use of time. So the trick is that when we create an experiment, it has to be a real experiment. So I'm guessing, like me, you've been in organizations where usually somebody at the top, is saying, oh, we're going to run an experiment. It'll be really cool. We've got this new thing. It'll be an experiment. We'll just try it and see how it works. And then it's never an experiment. It's just a way of getting something in, and it sounds a little nicer than just telling us what to do. That's a fake experiment. So we worked with a company, and the CEO, she made the decision that their ERP system was going to change, and she was just going to change it and say, this is it. And so she said, okay, well, we want to implement a new ERP system. It'll be an experiment. Let's just try it and see. We'll ask for your feedback as we go. And yeah, you can guess there was no feedback. It was not really an experiment. It was just a nice way of her implementing this or getting everybody else to implement. But it was essentially a command, right? So she wasn't asking for any influence. This was not a data-driven decision based on the results of an experiment. It was just her saying, yep, we're going to do this. That's not the kind of experiment we're talking about here. The experiments must have a hypothesis statement or a description. And the telltale sign is, does the experiment have an evaluation date? So yes, I want success criteria. If there are conditions around the experiment, then that should be in there as well. But the evaluation date is the most critical, right? Because if we say we're running an experiment and then we don't actually get together to evaluate what we learned and whether we continue a new experiment or say this experiment is done, it succeeded or it failed. Hopefully it succeeded, depending on what it is, and then you can accept it. It doesn't work. It has to be real. So beware of fake experiments and push for the evaluation date. That's the key sign. I think that's the most important sort of tangible evidence that it's a real experiment, is that there's an evaluation date associated with it. All right, so in this whole process of running experiments, we go from sort of this top down where we feel forced into a change to more of a involve and engage, and we have influence, and our leaders are supporting us in the experiment itself. So it changes the organizational perspective, if you will, of how we implement change. All right, and we need to act our way to new thinking. We can't think our way to new acting. So the only way to really make a change, especially if it's a new way of working or some sort of behavioral change in an organization, is to tie into how our brains change old habits. And the way that we do that is to decide to do something different. So that could be the experiment, and then actually do it. So running the experiment, and then getting feedback. Now, for the brain, we need positive feedback about new ways of working in order to implement, to make that a new habit. If we're getting negative feedback or, finding out it doesn't work, then it's better just to stop at your end date and do that evaluation and move forward. Either a different experiment or adjust the experiment. So for our brains to adapt new ways of working or changes that we want to make, we need to decide to do something different, do it, and then get positive feedback, feel the benefits, and then repeat. So that's the neuroscience behind how we change habits. And it's pretty important when we're looking at whether we implement the results of the experiment or if we change direction. All right, so here comes the interactive part. And Rickard, again, I'm going to rely on you. So what I want to do here is come up with a strategy for how to create an experiment around this particular scenario. So this came down from the management. It's a new company policy. Everyone must turn on their video function during online meetings. Now, if I could ask you to imagine that you are in this organization and you see another way of finding out whether or not this is the right thing to do or not. And fortunately, your management is open to experimenting, especially when you came to them and said, hey, look, instead of telling people what to do, what if we experimented with this first and then evaluate the results and then make a decision about this going forward after the experiment? So that's the scenario. And what I'd like you to think about and write in the chat, I hope if you're willing, is what could the title of this experiment be? Maybe a little description or a hypothesis statement. How long do we need to run it in order to get valid data? How long do we need to run this experiment? And then, and then what kind of success criteria? So how do we know? How do we know? And then any conditions. And what I mean by conditions here are, specific people that have to be involved, or, the technology has to work, or the internet connection has to be strong enough to support having everybody's video on.
We have
That's
already
what I
one
mean by
title.
Conditions here, something that sort of...
Run one meeting a week with cameras turned on.
Okay, cool. I'm going to go back. Okay, great. So
next one is
what makes
avoid
that
boring video sessions with everyone's video enabled. Suit up for meetings.
So if I could
suit up for
what
meetings.
Was that last one, okay? Suit up. I don't know, I like the pajamas. Okay, so there's something about how we frame the hypothesis statement. So if those hypotheses, or the title of the experiment plus the description, are sort of biased in one direction, I can't remember what the second one was, something like avoid boring meetings by turning on your video. Okay, so for some people, maybe it's less boring if they don't turn on their video. So understanding that how we frame the title or the hypothesis of the experiment is also important, because what we're trying to do is maybe borrow from the scientific method, that we have a non-biased hypothesis, so that when we look at the success criteria, we can then also make that based on physical evidence, if you will.
So we have two more
data points,
and also agreement on, on one like
cool. Thank you.
From Johan, a title: increase engagement with visual communications, and from Kara, assess the benefits and issues when using video function during online meetings.
Yeah. Okay. So the difference between those last two, right? The first one that you mentioned, that's also still has bias in it. The last one there, assess, right? So benefits or advantages, disadvantages. That's a nice example of a non-biased hypothesis statement. This is the experiment. We're going to assess the benefits and disadvantages of running online meetings with the video on. So that's a super nice starting point because it's very non-biased. And it's hard, right? Because we have our own biases about it. When you're facilitating these sessions where you're creating the experiment, be very aware of the bias. And the reason is, for some people, that will feel like one more way that you're forcing a change on me because of the way you position the experiment. So it's really, really critical to ask yourself those questions. You know, am I pushing this one way or another? And I don't mean you personally, but the group. Are we pushing this one way or another by the way that we're framing the title or the hypothesis of the experiment? Okay. All right. So now we've got our title. Cool. How long do we need to run this experiment? How long do we need to run it in order to get enough data? What do you think?
There's some coming in 3 to 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, a sprint, 5 times,
cool.
4 times, weeks, 2 weeks, month.
Yeah.
So we are between 1 and 4 weeks.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. I love it. You know, some experiments don't have to take that much time in order to get the data that you need. So if your experiment is around if you're doing big room planning or 90-day plannings or PI plannings or whatever you might call them in your organizations, you know, because we only do that every quarter, we might need to do that experiment for a whole year in order to get enough data to be valid. For something like this, a month or 5 meetings, yes. I mean, that's enough that you're going to get the kind of data that you need to make an evaluation about this. Cool. All right. So what are the success criteria? What could some of those be?
Nothing yet. Watching the chat. Acceptance, progress, self-evaluation of cooperation quality in meetings, employee happiness with meetings, satisfaction of the team with the meetings, have more fun during meetings.
So there's a super simple success criteria. It's probably so obvious that
more people are turning on the video,
that we're overlooking it. Yes. Yay. Yes. That's it. That, you know, and that is definitely data driven, right? So, and that could also maybe be one of the conditions, if you will, of this, is that we need to have enough people who actually turn on the video in order for us to assess whether or not, you know, this works or it doesn't work. Yeah, but I love all the other success criteria too. If you can think about your success criteria in sort of, I don't know, yes or no statements, that's also helpful. So, you know, did everyone have their video on, or did 75%, whatever you decide in your experiment, have their video on? Yes or no? And that makes it easy to sort of check the boxes when you're reviewing the criteria during your evaluation session. So cool. Yes. Great. Okay. So how about other conditions for this?
There's a nice one from Martin. Employees asking for better webcams. That's actually me.
Cool.
But I was not asking for. I just bought it because we work intent-based here at TechTalk.
Oh, even better.
Um,
Even better.
Get the reaction of others. Team morale raises. Participation, I think, increases. Yeah, but that's it. That's basically it.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So when you're looking at the success criteria, or also could be the conditions, and you want, increases, that also means that you need to do a baseline measure so that you know where you're starting at, so that when you do the follow-up measurements, and maybe you do it at a few points during the experiment to get as much data as possible. Because again, the idea here is that we want to be able to point to actual data and not just people's impressions of how it went, because we're all very biased. We see things through our own lenses. And the more that we can point to data, the better. And of course, when we're filling out a survey, that is also our perceptions. And it feels a bit more data driven. So there are ways to phrase those questions in a quick survey, for instance. So think about that as well, that if you're looking for increases or a decrease or whatever it is, that you'll also then need to do some sort of baseline measure so that you can get the data that you need to do the evaluation for your experiment. Great. Are there any other questions about or comments about this scenario?
I mean, I had basically this scenario. It's not that far away at the client, and they actually bought better VPN hardware to enable all people doing video calls. And they previously they had the other policy: don't turn on video because it ruins our network.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a condition, right? So the network can't handle it, then it's pretty
There's
hard
a question
to do it. And it's funny about
according to the loss aversion principle. I'm reading Morten Münster's latest book. Humans hate to lose more than they love to win. So is there a correlation to this principle and making sure the title of the experiment is not biased towards something negative?
Yeah, I think that just adds one more piece to the reason why we need to keep the titles or the hypotheses for the experiments as unbiased as we possibly can. So to take out those words that feel like one person wins or one loses or one side or one point of view or whatever. Yes, I think that's a one more sort of reinforcement about the importance of having your experiment be as unbiased as you possibly can make it. And a way to ensure that that happens is that when you create the experiment, you make sure you involve and engage people from, varying perspectives, from both sides, if you will, who might love having video on and others who might not like having video on for whatever reason, for example. So yeah, great. Thank you.
For now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And I'm looking at my time here too. So perfect. So I want to wrap up here. Sort of maybe the three key takeaways for why experiments work so well. One, we have a natural resistance to change. Our brain just automatically says change is dangerous, and it's to protect ourselves, right? It's a survival mechanism. So using experiments to overcome that resistance in a non-biased way is one way to help our brains settle down and focus and accept that, hey, we're going to try this, we're going to evaluate it, and then we'll make a decision. that helps our brains calm down and focus and be more open to changes. And then using experiments as a tool to break down change, especially where we feel uncertain. You know, the same way that we work in Agile, slicing, overwhelming or big things, we can do the same way with change. And not every change slice, if you will, has to be an experiment. I would really focus on those that create the most uncertainty or have the most resistance. Other things you can implement in other ways, but that's where experiments, in our experience anyway, work best. And then the last point here is that experiments really support positive thinking. So it's a way to nudge our brains into a more open, curious, interested space. And they're fun. Usually anyway, and people get really excited, and the more you do it, the more people want to do it. They're like, let's create an experiment. When are we going to do this? When are we going to evaluate? And it works. It just works. So thank you for being part of my little experiment here this morning as well. And like I said, I'll take a picture of this and post it on Twitter on the Agile Tour Vienna page. And thank you so much. And with that, if there are any other questions, I know we're a little over time, but Rickard, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Many thank yous coming in here. Cool talk, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also thank you.
Thank you
For these insights.